You are listening to the Overfunctioning Leadership Podcast, learning leadership concepts through life experience. Welcome, friends, to another Overfunctioning Leadership Podcast. I'm Alex McMahon.
John Moyer.
I'm Zach Stahl.
And we are happy to be with you today in your car or on your computer or coming through your earbuds or some other form, I'm not exactly sure.
Your Japanese pen pal is writing to you about us.
Yes. Yeah, we might as well go ahead and shout them out, I guess. We have some Japanese listeners, and we are very pumped that we're getting international with our podcast.
It's a relatively significant portion of our downloads,
yes.
Almost 10%. So let's boost that up, and you should definitely write in.
Yes, we would love to hear from you. Actually, no, for real, we would love to hear from you. Anyways, today we are going to be talking about self-differentiation. We've used this word a lot, and we probably be a good idea to define it for you. And this is, John, as you've said, this is the foundation for all of Bowen systems theory.
That's what Murray Bowen said.
So, but before we get there, we're going to recap our last Overfunctioning Leadership podcast, which was on perfectionism. So, gentlemen, what is perfectionism?
Well, I think we talked about perfectionism being a form of overfunctioning, or in some levels, a way of underfunctioning if it's preventing you from doing what you're doing.
Yeah, with the impetus for it was a letter that you received from a student. And
yes.
Maybe you could read that to recap what their question was.
Yeah, the question was, performance in college classes and jobs can be seen as an end-all, be-all. So with that in mind, how can one reduce anxiety in these situations, and how can one manage the pressure to perform with their values and goals?
I think that does undergird a part of self-differentiation that we'll share tonight, but the difference between what I believe is true for me and what I'm going to pursue and what others are doing. And, you know, that competition can be just from an observer standpoint and not wanting to get left behind. And so that can focus people to work really hard, which is helpful, but sometimes there's a cost involved. And that perfectionism piece is, when do I go from functioning to over-functioning, or from, what's the word I'm looking for? Achieving to overachieving. That's what I was looking for.
Yeah, and I remember you even talked about what is it costing you? And we're probably going to bring that up a whole lot when we talk through this podcast of it's always going to cost you something. So what is your overfunctioning to perfectionism? What is that costing you?
What's that return on investment? Right?
Yeah, exactly. So that was perfectionism, and we encourage you, and I encourage Zach, you to go back and listen to it as well.
Called out.
Actually, if I remember the podcast, Zach told us that while in college, he distinctly wanted to make sure he wasn't being a perfectionist, and thus, in some ways, underfunctioned.
It was almost exactly middle of the road, but I did err on the side of underfunctioning.
So maybe that's not for you then, so never mind. Anyways, then Zach and I, we went ahead and watched the movie Fences, a screenplay, award-winning screenplay, but then turned into a film that was directed and starred Denzel Washington. And what was this about, Zach?
Yeah, so in our Zammer, right, which is our Zach and Alex movie review,
yes,
we reviewed Fences, and it was just a fantastic screenplay where Alex and I differed on opinions on the story of a man and his family, and basically it was a story of self-sabotage.
Yeah, well, yeah, self-sabotage, but also sabotage of the entire family.
Yeah.
So basically, the movie could have been called Sabotage instead, and it would have been just as well. So it was, Zach and I had a good time talking about it, and we were pretty ridiculous throughout. And so it was good because we were arguing with each other. So
it was a good time. We learned a lot about what we already knew because we've seen Denzel Washington.
So, and if you want to get a little inkling, and this is a little spoiler of the podcast itself, Priscilla gave it a half a sniff.
Was there a wolf? I can't remember.
No wolves.
No wolves.
No wolves. So just, I don't want to give everything away, but if that's telling you anything.
And if you don't know who Priscilla is, you should check it out, preferably through the video format on the YouTube.
Yes. So I believe this is going to then take us into the fables section of our podcast. So go ahead and bring out your big pot of hot apple cider, slap that onto the stove, and warm it up because it's fable time. And I believe with fable time, that means that John has a fable for us. So John, what do you got for us today?
Well, the fable I have today is a story about a person I was speaking with recently. And as we were talking about Bowen theory and this idea of self-differentiation, she mentioned to me that in her family, throughout generations, that there's been difficult relationships between mothers and daughters. And that's been a family legacy of hers going back generations. That was her observation. And wouldn't you know it, her husband and her were blessed with 2 girls. And so early on in the girls' lives, she remembers thinking, I'm going to change this in my family. And she really was intentional about trying to cultivate better relationships with her and her daughters. And so she shared that journey and some setbacks and maybe some successes along the way.
And a lot of this generational discussion could come back to another book that was written by Ed Freeman called Generation to Generation, in which he talks about the nuclear family or the immediate family, if you don't nuclear, about how this anxiety that is within a family gets passed down from generation to generation. So it makes sense that if a mother is having issues with a relationship with her daughter, then most likely her mother also had an issue with her, and that just keeps continually getting passed down. So the step that this woman that is taking to get towards fixing that relationship in a way, whatever that means to them, is a good first step to breaking a trend that may have been taking generations.
Yeah, and she was actually discouraged in our conversation because she was mentioning that her one daughter that's in her mid-20s now is in therapy. And she said to me, after all my efforts, what's the result? My daughter's sitting in therapy. And she, just kind of welled up with tears and was really discouraged by, in her mind, a lack of progress in making a change in her family. And I think it undermines not undermines, but it demonstrates the difficulty at changing family, but it's an important undertaking, and she's committed to do it, but it's not been easy.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think that you see her reliving those generational sins. And when we think of, say, alcoholism and how that's passed down hereditarily, there's also, if it's not purely genetic, then there must be something else. And that's in large part what family systems theories is trying to explain. You're teaching maybe on some level a coping mechanism, and that's one way that's passed down. And that's a very specific example, but in the same way that you deal with stresses with alcohol, you can address your relationship with your mother in the same way that she addressed her relationship with her mother.
Yeah, and John, you and I were talking just the other day about this thought of foundational, and what was the other one that you were talking about? Foundational.
So the different types of differentiation,
yes,
the base differentiation and functional differentiation.
Yeah.
So the foundation piece of that is the base, and then the functional. And what I shared with this person is that she has been attempting to change the family's functioning, and that's base differentiation. Base differentiation is really what we inherit from our parents down the lineage, and she is doing the hard work of changing that and maturing self. And what I was sharing with her is I asked her a little bit about the therapy her daughter was going through and how it was going, and I even asked her if her daughter shares with her anything that goes on in the therapy sessions or whether it's private. And she said, actually, my daughter asks me to be in the room with her when she's meeting with a therapist. And So I thought, well, maybe there's a three-way conversation going on. And she said, no, I sit off to the side, alone and read. I hear everything going on, but I'm not part of the dialogue, but I'm in the room. And I asked her why that is the case, why her daughter wants her in there, but as opposed to just going on her own. And she says, I'm really not sure. And so I was thinking about this idea of, as this person has decided to mature self, the other aspect of differentiation is called functional differentiation, which is the idea that someone can borrow maturity from another, borrow self from another.
Yeah.
And that perhaps by this person raising her own base differentiation to a point of strength, it allows others to borrow self from her, in this case, her daughter, and allows her daughter to be on a journey of maturity that otherwise she may not be.
So wait, hold up a second. We have just said the word differentiation a ton, and I think that's the topic of this podcast.
So we might as well just jump right on into that. So the overall question we're trying to answer here is, what is self-differentiation? So Zach, could you help us out maybe with just the overall term of differentiation, what that might mean?
So when you hear the word differentiation, I think of like setting oneself apart, like the process of making oneself different. But I was actually reading this book, Applying Family Systems Theory to Mediation by Wayne F. Regina. And he, I believe, mentions that self-differentiation, he might be speaking specifically about differentiation. It is the ability to self-reflect thoughtfully, self-manage one's thinkings, feelings, and behavior, clearly define a self, and effectively connect with others. And so, I don't know, what does that mean?
Well, I'll go to the differentiation part because we use this word, and it's funny because other people will be like, what the heck are you talking? What is this self-differentiation? What is this? But over the last, I would say, 2 or 3 weeks, Pandora at School will be on, and there's a commercial that comes across about getting your MBA. And the guy's like, you should get your MBA because you will become differentiated. You become a differentiated leader. And I was like, hey, wait a second. He's saying differentiated. So in that way, differentiated is you're becoming different. Then in this case, if I'm becoming a differentiated leader in my MBA, when I go to apply for jobs, I'll be different from other people, hopefully in a better way.
Yeah, and I think you'll be different from the group. So there's a group of MBA candidates, and you will be a differentiated person. You'll be a different person from the group. So I think the idea of self-differentiation is, in the midst of a group, being a separate self, being a separate person with separate ideas, and the idea that a differentiated person is one who leads a life from conviction, from their principles of what they believe is right. They're open to what the group thinks, and they'll consider what the group thinks, but ultimately they've thought pretty hard about what they believe as a person, and they seek to live their life that way.
And that can be different, very different from their nuclear family of where the origin of where they became those beliefs or those convictions. And so a lot of the things that you and I believe originally came from your nuclear family. And so that when we talk about generation to generation, not too long ago here in the same podcast, not only are you learning this different ways of handling anxiety and reactivity, in a lot of ways you're learning the same convictions. You're adopting those same convictions from that nuclear family. And so some of those may be good, but some of those may, as you grow as a person and become differentiated, you may not be in agreement with anymore.
Yeah, so we're talking about differentiation, and when we apply it to ourselves, we call it self-differentiation, right? So when we add the word self, there's a lot of baggage that comes along with self, because in Bowen's theory, there's this idea of the pseudo-self, right? And then there's this self that's centered on convictions, and we've talked about that a little bit in past episodes.
Yeah.
But as you were saying, when you have a lot of convictions and beliefs that don't really have a basis for yourself, but something that you've heard around you. That's what we call the pseudo-self. And the things that you hold fast to are the things that really make up who you are. So what are we saying that plays in with differentiation?
Well, I think the pseudo-self is a person that's relatively undifferentiated. You mentioned it's a borrowed self. And early in our life as kids, I think about what we borrowed from parents. So our parents taught us to work hard, tell the truth, be on time, things that in life help us to function better. And those are all good ideas, things that we teach our students or children or nephews and nieces when they're young. So they do that because we tell them this is the right thing to do, and they borrow that. So I think there's an element when you're small where you borrow those beliefs. But eventually, as you grow, you discard ones that for you just aren't true or just aren't working, and not based on reactivity or rebellion, but based on really concrete beliefs that one develops through experience and some serious thinking.
Now, you've talked about this borrowing of self quite a bit here, and I think it's also, this is one of my favorite pieces of borrowing self is you can borrow self from people, but you can also borrow self from pets. And so it's one of my favorite ones where you borrow from your pet. So this isn't just one of those things where you borrow self from people. And I think for me, it made a lot of sense when you borrow self from like your pet. So if you have a dog, I don't know what you do if you have a cat. John, you have a cat, Charlie, but maybe you can explain how cats work. But I know for dogs, when I come home, my dog Misha is like super in love with me, and she's like pumped to see me every time and super happy. So I can borrow from her happiness, and it makes myself a little bit happier. So on the cat end, John, go.
There's not much borrowing from a cat. I would say cats are more differentiated than dogs. I really think they do what they think they want to do, and if they're not interested in being with you, then they just won't. So,
do they have a developed forebrain?
I'm not sure they have much of a brain at all, actually. That's just a thought. But, you mentioned the pet. So shout out to my leadership concepts class, by the way, because we talked about this, that if you're a pet owner, then perhaps you're not very differentiated. And we posited the idea that the more pets you have, the less mature you are. And if you go to the zoo frequently, you are way down on the differentiation scale. So they thought that was a bit much, but we were a little bit playful with that. But yeah, I would agree. You can borrow self from people, but if for individuals that say, I like my dog better than people, I think there's some truth to the borrowing of self there. But you're free to reject anything we say.
And I have a dog. You've got a cat. Now Zach doesn't have any animals.
My parents had 2 cats, and they were pretty dumb.
But I would say though, Zach, you do have some like cacti at home that you
have
at sometimes would
so many cacti
that you would pull some of yourself from the cacti.
They're very happy when it's rainy, and so I'm very happy when it's rainy. So I don't know what that gets me, but
happiness, is that's what it brings
happiness.
You. Yeah. So we've talked a bit here about self-differentiation, defining it. One of my favorite definitions, just look, there's a whole book that John brought called Differentiation of Self. And it's edited by Peter, what is it?
Titleman.
Titleman, yes. But it's a whole bunch of journal articles, so scientific journal articles, all combined into this book, right, John?
It is.
And so, and then there is so much information from Marie Bowen about self-differentiation. You can read a whole bunch of different things, right? So we're not going to beat a dead horse on that one. No beating of horses. We like animals. So you can borrow from horses too. But anyways, the overall, the one that I really like, and this comes from Failure of Nerve, from Ed Freeman.
It's like the only book you read.
I know, basically. You have to get up before your people and give an I have a dream speech. And when we talked about convictions, like the I am a dream speech clearly states, this is what I think, this is my conviction, and then that will drive you for this self-differentiation. So,
Well said, Ed.
yes, great job, buddy. So I think the question that we need to, well, we've kind of answered this and danced around a little bit here, but let's just make sure that we clarify this. The last question I have is, how do you become more self-differentiated? So how can I become more self-differentiated?
Well, I want to start this by reading an example of a less differentiated person, which I think
Okay.
when we hear that, it's going to strike us as, wow, I really don't want to be that kind of person. But if we think about it, we can all think of situations in which we are like that. And this is from Wayne F. Regina. And it goes, a less differentiated person has fewer resources and is less adaptive. Like a rubber band stretched too often, he reacts more automatically and lacks resiliency to bounce back from stressful encounters. He is less emotionally free, and his reactivity can take many forms, including reactive thinking, reactive feeling, and reactive behavior. He is less focused on his internal compass and thus less capable of taking personal responsibility. His impulse is to criticize others and to get them to change. He is also more influenced by those in his present and past. He uses relationship cutoff, emotional distance, and triangulation, key Bowen theory concepts, to manage conflict, and he tends to fault others for his life circumstances.
Two things. One, if you listen to our reactivity podcast, we talked a lot about all these different things. Two, he also includes women in that. The he pronoun was. We just want to make sure
Sure.
that we toss that in there.
It's not gender discriminatory, that's for sure. I think of, as you read that paragraph, what kept standing out to me was that, and I liked your point about we all vacillate between differentiation and lesser differentiation. And I would say as anxiety rises, we tend to be more of the undifferentiated person. But anyways, one of the common themes was the idea of relationships. So for people who are relatively undifferentiated, relationships are everything. And they think about them all the time. Who likes me? Who doesn't like me? Who's for me? Who's against me? And it's just about getting self from others and loaning self to others. A lot of borrowing and trading of selves for individuals who are relatively undifferentiated.
And you see that with what people are talking about, too. If your beliefs are influenced by the people who are around you, if John starts talking about politics, I'm going to agree with him because I want him to like me.
Go Whig Party.
And there is a fundamental, and maybe we'll do a dating podcast at some point, which would be very interesting. Not very good at it, so I'm not sure what I have to bring to the table. And John, the last time you dated somebody was, well, I mean, it was your wife, so... Is it just a current one big date right now?
It went well, actually, yes. No triangles involved.
It's probably good.
Yeah, so anyways, there is a fundamental term when it talks about, like, when you are thinking about somebody, when you think about that person a lot, most likely, in some cases, probably not thinking about you. And when you do that, you're becoming more undesirable through that, unattractive, because nobody... I mean, I'm not saying nobody, but in a lot of terms, that if somebody's being thought about a lot, they don't really like that. It's a lot of pressure, a lot going on there. So when it talks about those relationships, that's the first thing I thought of is they think about the relationships a lot and like overboard mode to where other people don't really want to be thought that much about.
So, Alex, what you're saying is your type is disinterested in you.
Yeah. I don't know how to really answer that question. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem.
So as far as becoming more self-differentiated, it's going to come down to convictions, right? What else? I mean, what are the bases here? Coming up with convictions?
The quote I read talked about an internal compass, and I thought that was interesting. If I'm focusing on relating to other people through beliefs and ideas that I don't really share, and it's not really a discussion of that, like I'm just floating around, attaching myself to whoever's around. Whereas when I think of this internal compass, it's, a compass is directed at a true north, right?
Oh, compass. Got
compass.
it.
What am I saying? Compass?
I don't know what you're saying. Compass.
Compass.
That's how we say it here in Northeast Ohio.
Yeah.
Better get it right.
I'm from a different part of Ohio.
Stark County.
Yes. Yeah.
But when I'm directed at that true north, right? Well, what is that? Well, if that's my personal beliefs and my convictions, if it's the way I define myself and it's the goals that I am actively seeking after, well, that's the kind of story that you want to hear about. That's what are the movies that you like? What are the books you like to read? Well, they're all very directed people, and it's typically, something that they're trying to attain and grow themselves in the process.
Yeah. And we'll say this almost every single podcast. This is a lifelong thing. So your convictions and those things can change over time. And that's okay. One thing that I've been running into every once in a while since I'm becoming a more gentlemanly in my age. Another way of just saying I'm getting older. Is I will hear this every once in a while. You may get stuck in your ways as you get older. And I think on that case would be you're becoming less self-differentiated and just sticking to whatever you thought was your convictions at one point, maybe, or maybe you don't. I don't know. I find that phraseology interesting. Any thoughts on that, John?
Well, I was sharing with my leadership class a little bit about conviction and what you think is important. And as a Christian, the verse Romans 12, chapter 12, verse 2, and let us be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And I remember in high school, the idea of secular music I felt was not renewing my mind or other Christians. And for those who were of the faith, listening to secular music, I thought, how can you listen to the music that talks about ways that are clearly displeasing to God and still be true to this verse? And I became hostile and angry at people for listening to secular music. And obviously my influence was about zero with those individuals who would go running away when I would get on my diatribes. But I still believe in Scripture and I believe in renewing my mind, but I'm not going to think for another about how they do that. So I think I haven't left that conviction, but I've allowed others to explore that journey on their own. And I think as I've become calmer about that belief, it's allowed my influence towards others to grow because I'm not invading their space with my belief. So I think there's a journey for all of us.
Or your unwanted advice.
That's
basically.
right, which always goes so well.
Yes, exactly. Well, any other bits and pieces we want to hear about self-differentiation you guys got?
I'm interested in closing with some synonyms of differentiation to just really help us latch onto this concept.
You're like the synonym. Last time we did this with synonyms, you came up with ones that were attached to, I believe, what was it? Saboteurs, and they all went terribly awful. I'm hoping that these go even worse.
These ones are quoted. Are Wayne F. Regina? He quoted them.
Okay.
From our man Friedman himself.
Oh, okay.
Right.
All right.
I think Friedman.
So the Godfather himself.
The Godfather. Uh-huh. Maybe it might have even been Bowen, the OG. But he says synonyms for differentiation include emotional maturity, personal integrity, ability to adapt to life's various situations and challenges, and a willingness to accept personal responsibility for one's being and destiny.
Boom. I think that's pretty much will wrap us up, I believe. Good. Well,
great.
Self-differentiation. We encourage you to do it. It's a lifelong journey, and it is difficult at times. But the more you become a solid self this way, we all believe that it's going to be your anxiety is going to lessen, and I think in a lot of ways your life become more fulfilling. So we have a couple of shout-outs before we get out of here.
So let us give thanks for Jesse Huffstetler, or Jetler as he's known on Spotify, for this. What do you remember what it's called, John? It's
called Squagmire.
The Squagmire.
Squagmire.
Yeah, the Starfish Limiter.
Starfish
Yeah,
Limiter.
the Starfish
Sorry.
Limiter. Thanks, Jesse, for that. And he's also helped us get our soundboard working, and he's just a valuable source of knowledge.
Okay, wait. All right. I don't know if I can end this without asking a few questions. You referenced Murray Bowen as the OG. What is OG?
Original gangster. It is some people just mean original. I mean,
Okay, gotcha.
yeah.
My man, am I getting old?
Yeah, Peter Titleman refers to him that way in his book.
Oh
The
man,
OG.
I'm really. And you just auto reverse like recorders.
Well, I was going to say thanks to
Discmans.
Jesse. He's fixed my auto reverse cassette player. The tape got wound up in there and got all congealed, and he got that unwound for me. So
he got his number 2 pencil out and
did.
spun it around a few times.
Yep, it was really helpful.
Congealed, another good word. And I was going to ask you what squagmire is, but I have a feeling it just made some word up.
No, it's actually a true statement. Squagmire.
What is a squagmire?
It's when you're playing Foursquare with people on the playground, and you have a dispute, and you can't resolve the dispute. It's called a squagmire.
It's
A combination of square and quagmire.
specific to Foursquare.
It is squagmire.
Unbelievable. Well,
Wow.
awesome. We're learning so much today.
Wow.
A few ways to check us out. If you want to contact us, you can contact us on email through theofpodcast@gmail.com. Also on our Facebook page, or you can watch us on YouTube and comment there as well. You can get us on iTunes, on Google Play, on Simplecast, direct download, or through their player. So lots of different opportunities to get a hold of us. And with that, I believe we're ending this podcast.
Time to sign off.
Yes, I am the semi-solid Alex.
I'm Squagmire.
I'm just Zach.
We'll see you later.
Bye.
Bring out your big pot of hot apple cider, slap that onto the stove, and warm it up because it's fable time.
I'm very happy when it's rainy.
Edwin H. Friedman.
Man, am I getting old?
It's when you're playing Foursquare with people on the playground, and you have a dispute, and you can't resolve the dispute. It's called a squagmire. A combination of square and quagmire.